Hey readers, it's cozy mystery author Meg Muldoon here, and I want to welcome you to another episode of my cozy happy hour segment. My apologies. I normally post these on Fridays, but I've been kind of under the weather this past week with some allergies, and I'm feeling better now though. So I really wanted to get this out to you at least by this weekend. So I'm so happy that you're here, and thank you for joining me for part three of Warren and the Sparks Lake Mystery. In this segment of the novella, of the Christmas River novella, we're going to find out a few different things, including, well, I guess we'll just get to it. Without further ado, here is Warren and the Sparks Lake Mystery, Part 3, Chapter 11. Warren found himself driving back down that dirt road leading up to the lakes, thinking about May Reed and those beautiful, sad eyes of hers. He didn't know how he was going to help the Reed family. Hell, he couldn't even get a passing grade in English. How was he going to help prove that Leroy was innocent? Who did Warren think he was? Humphrey Bogart? The sun was slouching toward the horizon as Warren pulled up next to the general store. Pete's car was gone, and the place was closed up and empty. Warren got out of his car. The wind had kicked up, and he could taste frost on the air. He wondered if it might not snow tonight. Snowstorms weren't unheard of in May here in Central Oregon. Winter had a tight grip in this part of the country, and most years she didn't let go without a fight. Warren stood in front of the general store, gazing numbly at the bloodstains on the dusty ground. He didn't know much of such things, but he did know that shooting a man in the back was cowardly business. The man being shot had no chance to respond, no chance to retaliate. Most of the time he probably had no idea what hit him or who hated him so badly they wanted him dead. Maybe it also spoke to the perpetrator of the act, too, and what kind of person they were. A cowardly person, too ashamed to even look in the face of... Just then, Warren thought he heard the sound of branches breaking somewhere in the distance across the lake. He turned around, his eyes scanning the woods that were growing darker with each passing minute. Warren could see nothing, but he'd been sure of what he'd heard. He was also sure that it had been something heavy snapping those branches. Warren took pride in his good hearing, and he didn't ever second-guess himself when it came to that, unlike his vision, which wasn't nearly as good. Warren headed in the direction of the sound, quietly walking away from the dirt road and into the shadowy woods. The sun was descending quickly now, and above the tree canopy had caught fire with the dying light. He walked silently, avoiding branches and debris that would make noise. He heard another crackling sound in the distance. Just then, Warren noticed something flash in the thick forest up ahead. It was a long beam of light that cut through the shadows. A flashlight, he realized. The light hit his face suddenly, and he instinctively jumped behind a large tree trunk. He knelt down, his fingers sinking into the damp soil. Warren's heart hammered hard in his rib cage. "Who's there?" a voice cried out from somewhere beyond the tree trunk. Warren thought for a moment about yelling back and showing his face, but something in his bones told him not to, like one of those superstitious feelings that Pete was always talking about. Warren held his tongue and listened some more. After a few moments of silence, he could hear the breaking of twigs again. When he thought enough time had passed, Warren drew in a deep breath, gathered up his courage, and stuck his head out from behind the tree trunk. At first he could only make out the shadowy figure of a man in the woods. Warren watched the figure for a long time, and he realized that it looked familiar to him. It was the same one he'd seen when he came to the lake on Sunday night, the one carrying a rifle, the one he thought was Leroy. Of course, now it couldn't be Leroy. The figure wasn't making much progress, ambling slowly along. Warren noticed that the flashlight wasn't so much lighting the way for the figure as it was scouring the forest floor, back and forth, back and forth, back in. The man knelt down suddenly, reaching for something on the ground. Warren saw the glint of something metallic as the man dropped the thing he had picked up into his pocket. Warren's eyes widened. Then he felt something else, a tickling of the hairs of his nose. At first it was subtle, but before Warren knew it, the sensation became unbearable. It was spring pollen that was the cause, and though Warren tried to fight it, he knew there wasn't much he could do. He muffled it as best as he could. Achoo! Just as he sneezed, the gnarly twig he'd been leaning against snapped. The sound echoed loudly through the forest. "Who is that?" the man's voice rang out as the light swung in Warren's direction. Warren held in his breath and quietly cursed his weakness for spring pollen. He heard the sound of heavy footsteps on the forest floor. They were coming in his direction. "Chicken, show yourself!" Warren felt his insides tremble like Marionberry jam. He was caught, and there was nothing he could do. He prepared for the worst. But to his surprise, the sound of the footsteps stopped just short of his hiding place. There was a moment of silence. The man was so close, Warren could hear him breathing. Ragged, uneven breaths. Scared breaths, Warren realized. He closed his eyes and waited. A moment later, the sound of those heavy footsteps went in the opposite direction and became faint. Warren steeled himself. Then he peeked around the tree trunk again. It was a flash, a moment right before the man disappeared into the dark shadows. But in that flash, Warren saw everything he needed to know. Warren hid again, pressing his back to the tree, his heart racing inside his chest. He gazed out through the trees as the last light of the day hit the front porch of the general store in the distance, listening to those footsteps until the sound of them disappeared. Chapter 12. Warren had been up most of the night, going over it in his head, and now he was nearly certain that Leroy Reed had nothing to do with Clyde Driggs being shot. Only Warren couldn't go to the sheriff just yet. It wouldn't be right, because being nearly certain wasn't the same as being certain. So after school that day, Warren waited in the parking lot of Christmas River High by the red hardtop convertible. The dusting of snow that had fallen overnight was long gone by now, and the sun was shining strong in a pale blue spring sky. After about 10 minutes, Warren spotted him coming across the lot. Philip Clayton was wearing the same Letterman jacket that he'd been wearing the night before in the woods. He was surrounded by a pack of jock friends and was laughing like a fool. He looked cheerful, like he didn't have a care in the world. Only Warren had seen him in the woods the night before and knew otherwise. One by one, the jocks peeled off to their own cars. Philip was alone by the time he got to the convertible. "You got a moment to talk, Phil?" Philip opened the side door and tossed his textbooks in. "If this is about the Reed girl and her brother, I told you, you got me confused with somebody else. I wasn't anywhere near the general store the other day." Warren could detect fear in Philip's voice as he spoke, and Warren suddenly felt very certain that he was right. Right that it was Philip, not Leroy, who he'd seen Sunday night out in the woods around Sparks Lake. That Philip was out killing animals with his rifle the way he bragged to May about. That on the morning Mr. Driggs was shot in the back, Philip was out there again. And that Philip had been the one to shoot Mr. Driggs that morning. Because Warren had seen Philip out there the night before, looking for shell casings and any other evidence he might have left behind in the woods, trying to cover his tracks. "I know that you're lying, Philip," Warren said, feeling emboldened by the fear in the jock's voice. "You know how I know? Because I saw you last night." Something angry passed across Philip's eyes then. "So that was you," Philip said, poking a sharp finger into Warren's shoulder. "Where do you get off spying on people? You cruising for a bruisin'?" Philip started stepping toward Warren, readying for a fight. Warren didn't back down. "You shot him, didn't you? You shot Mr. Driggs," Warren said in a strong voice. Philip stopped in his tracks. His eyes grew wide. His mouth dropped a little. He stayed like that for a long, long minute. "This is about that Reed girl, isn't it?" Philip said, rage flashing across his eyes. "You've got a crush on her and you think we're together, so you're making all this up." Philip's face scrunched up with disgust. "Listen, you can have her. Broad's no good anyway. Comes from a family of bottom feeders and shall always be one." What happened next wasn't one of Warren's prouder moments. But when Philip started talking about May in that tone, something inside of him snapped. Fire erupted in Warren's knuckles as he landed a hard punch smack dab in the middle of Philip Clayton's stupid square jaw. The big jock reeled backward at the hit, almost as surprised as Warren was. It was then that Warren realized he'd just committed an act that could affect the rest of his life. He'd just punched Philip Clayton in the face, not just the most popular guy in school, not just the quarterback of the football team, but the son of Basil Clayton, the richest and most influential man in Christmas River. Not to mention the man who employed Warren's father. Warren backed away in the parking lot, watching as Philip staggered to his feet. The jock was holding his jaw like it might come unhinged if he let go. Warren waited for Philip to come at him, to retaliate, but the moment never came. Philip just stood there, hunched over, holding his jaw. Then Warren heard the sob. Philip's entire body began convulsing. Big fat tears hit the concrete. "You're right," he wailed. "It's my fault. I shot Mr. Driggs." Chapter 13. Later that afternoon, the two boys sat at the Marionberry Diner downtown. Philip had ordered a strawberry ice cream shake and was slurping it down nervously. "You don't know what it's like," Philip said in a low voice between slurps. "You don't know what it's like to be Basil Clayton's son in this town." It had taken nearly half an hour before Philip Clayton had stopped sobbing like a little boy, and in that time Warren saw the jock for what he was, a frightened kid who had done something stupid and was now lily-white scared of the consequences. Warren thought if he bought him a shake, it might calm him down, and so far it seemed to be working. Philip was finally talking in coherent sentences, and although his jaw was swelling up from where Warren had punched him, at least he'd stopped crying. "My dad doesn't like me going out in the woods and hunting," Philip said. "He says it's not fitting behavior for the future governor of Oregon. That's what he says I'm going to be, but I don't want to be governor. Hell, I don't even want to run that stupid old mill one day like him. All I want to do is get the hell out of this Nowheresville town and have some adventure." Philip sucked down his shake in big, beefy gulps. "The only thing I like doing is being out in the woods, away from him. That's why I spend so much time out there. I can't stand being at home. I was out there all night and into the morning that Mr. Driggs was." Philip trailed off, looking out the window that faced Main Street. Warren noticed that Sandra, the diner waitress, was stealing glances in their direction every once in a while. She'd noticed Philip's swollen jaw, as well as Warren's bloodied hand. "I was doing some target practice that morning," Philip continued, in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "Nobody's ever out that early at Sparks Lake. I was having a good time, but a little later I heard some commotion down near the general store. When I got back into town, I heard about Mr. Driggs getting shot in the back, and it was an accident." "An accident? I never meant to shoot him, I swear." Philip finished off the rest of his shake. He ran a hand through his muddy brown hair. "My father's going to kill me. I'll never become governor after they find out about this. Murderers don't become governors. They don't." A couple of big, fat tears spilled over Philip's cheeks. He turned his face toward the window so nobody would see. "Philip, we have to go to the sheriff's office. Don't you see? They got Leroy sitting in jail for the crime. If Mr. Driggs dies, then they'll charge him with murder. Do you know what that means?" Philip tugged at the collar of his jacket. "Yeah, I know what it means," he said nervously. "It means that if I tell them the truth, then I'm the one going away for murder instead." "It was an accident," Warren said. "An accident. People will understand." "No, they won't," he said in a high, screechy tone. Warren could see how scared he was, and he could see that his words about justice weren't getting through to Philip. "My father, most of all. He's going to take me out of his will after this, and I'll have nothing then." "You have to tell Sheriff Coe about what really happened," Warren said again. "You just have to." Philip stood up suddenly, nearly knocking over the strawberry-rimmed glass on the table. That volatile look was back in his eyes again. "You don't tell anybody about this, you hear?" he rasped. "No one will believe you anyway. You're nothing, Warren, a nobody. Who's going to take your word over mine?" The waitress was watching them again. Philip looked around the diner with shifty eyes. Then he bolted out of the front door. Chapter 14. "He did it, sir. He admitted as much to me. Philip Clayton shot Clyde Driggs." Once again, Warren had that feeling of a frog being steadily boiled alive under the stare of Sheriff Sullivan Coe. Only this time, Warren had willingly jumped into the pot of boiling water himself. The sheriff leaned back in his chair and looked out the window of his office for a long while. The office was located in a nondescript beige building a few blocks away from Main Street, and Warren had walked there as soon as Philip left the diner. Warren didn't like being a snitch or a tattletale. It wasn't in his nature. He would have much rather the truth come from Philip himself, but unless the rich kid had a change of heart, that wasn't going to happen. And Warren couldn't stand the thought of Leroy sitting in jail all this time for something he didn't do. It wasn't just about May either, Warren realized. It was about right and wrong, about a good man getting a raw deal over a crime he didn't commit. Warren sat there in Sheriff Coe's sparse office, his stomach turning as he waited for the man to speak. "Why should I believe you?" Sheriff Coe finally said, flashing those hellfire eyes at Warren. You lied to us when we questioned you before. What's changed? Warren gulped hard. Philip said he did it, sir, Warren said. It was an accident, but he's too chicken to come in and tell you. The sheriff looked out the window again, saying nothing. Warren cleared his throat. I understand your hesitation in believing me, Sheriff Coe, but Leroy didn't do it, and he shouldn't be blamed for... Thanks for coming in, son, but I'm afraid you've made a mistake. Warren furrowed his brow. A mistake? What do you mean, a mistake? Sheriff Coe stood up. Philip Clayton couldn't have done it. He was asleep at home the morning it happened, the way any young man his age should be. Warren stood up too, feeling confused. Excuse me, Sheriff, but how do you know that Basil Clayton had Mrs. Coe and myself over for breakfast that morning? That's how, he said. And Philip was in his room fast asleep. I'd vouch for it myself. He's a good boy, star athlete, and he couldn't be capable of the thing you're suggesting. Warren peered at the sheriff, struggling for words that he couldn't find. It was obvious that Sheriff Coe was lying. He didn't even try to make it a good lie. He just said the words out loud, listlessly, like it didn't matter whether Warren believed him or not. Clearing one guilty man of wrongdoing and sending an innocent one to jail for the rest of his life instead. Warren felt a kind of fury at the injustice of it all climb up the back of his throat. You have it wrong, sir, Warren said. I talked to Philip and he said, but Sheriff Coe was already herding Warren out of his office. Doesn't matter what Philip Clayton said. I'm the sheriff, and I know what I know. Sheriff Coe opened the door to his office, nearly pushing the teenager out. And if you're smart, sonny boy, and don't want any trouble, then you'll know it too, he added. Warren stood there, staring at Sullivan Coe in utter disbelief. It was that day that Warren learned about the nature of money, power, and corruption in the world. Chapter 15. Warren sat at the kitchen table later that week, picking at the meatloaf his mother had served for dinner. Meatloaf was never his favorite meal, but it was even more to his disliking tonight. Warren had been feeling down the past few days, even with the news that Clyde Driggs's condition was stabilizing and that doctors were beginning to believe that he might pull through. Warren had seen another side to Christmas River that week, a side that he didn't know had ever existed in his hometown. Warren knew that life wasn't fair, but he'd grown up believing that justice always won out in the end. Now he realized that that wasn't true, and it didn't sit well with him. It never would either. Terrible thing, this Clyde Driggs business, his father said, finishing off the last of the meatloaf on his plate, not only for Clyde, but for everyone involved. Did you hear something new? Etta Peters asked. Remember my friend Benny Hale at the mill? Well, he was in Leroy's unit during the war. He's friends with the Reed family, and he said that the doctor had to pay the Reed house a visit 3 times this week. The father is ailing worse than ever now, with Leroy being arrested. Warren swallowed the dry lump of meat in his mouth and didn't say anything. Poor thing, Warren's mother said. Yes, and Benny said that with Leroy in jail, there's nobody left to fend for the family except the oldest girl, Mary. May, Warren quietly said, correcting him. Oh, that's right, May, his father said. Is she in your class, Warren? May hadn't been in class since Leroy was arrested, and Warren knew that was the way it was going to be from now on. She would have to go to work, and all those smarts she had, all those exams she got back from Mr. Stanley with big A's at the top, none of it mattered anymore. It didn't seem right that some families like Philip Clayton's were well off and had sons that did whatever they wanted to do without consequences. Meanwhile, because a smart girl like May came from a poor family, she'd now miss out on opportunities that the Philip Claytons of the world took for granted. It didn't seem right at all. Warren? He looked up. Both his mother and father were staring at him as if they'd been trying to get his attention for some time. He stood up. May I be excused? He asked. Warren's mother peered at him. Yes, she finally said. Warren went for his jacket and then left the house, feeling the undigested meatloaf sitting like a lump of coal at the back of his throat. Chapter 16. Warren could have driven anywhere, but he found himself following the same old road up to the lakes. He didn't have much money. What he'd saved over the years from working after school at the general store he'd used to buy his car. Maybe he could sell that, he thought. Maybe that would be enough to keep May in school, at least for a little while. He thought of her brown eyes, the way they shone that day by the lake from beneath a pool of tears. She was tough. He could see that in her. But why did she have to be? Why was life easy for some people and hard for others? He drove along the bumpy dirt road, the evening sun gently dancing through the shimmering pine needles overhead. Summer would be here soon, usually his favorite time of year, but Warren felt no excitement for the coming season. All he felt was a dull sense of dread at the center of his chest. He pulled up across the road from the general store, noticing that Pete's car was there. Warren felt glad at the sight of it. With his brother doing better, Pete's mood had gotten back to its usual cheerful, gregarious state. Though Warren hadn't been back at the general store all week, it had stayed closed. He'd run into Pete at the hospital the day before when he and his mother had gone to drop some flowers off. Pete seemed back to his old self, and Warren was glad for it. When he saw him at the hospital, Warren considered telling Pete the truth about how Philip Clayton was the one responsible for his brother's injury, but it just didn't feel like the right time to tell him somehow. Maybe now it was, and maybe, if Pete believed him, he'd go to Sheriff Coe's office with Warren again. Sheriff Coe could ignore a 17-year-old kid, but he wouldn't be able to ignore the brother of the victim as easily. Maybe there was a way that justice could still win out. Warren got out of his car and walked up to the general store. It was a nice evening, and the air was warm and pleasant. Warren could sense whisperings of summer, and he knew that soon the lake would be crowded with families fishing and canoeing, enjoying the long, lazy days of summer in Central Oregon. He walked up the steps of the general store swiftly, bypassing the brown stains and trying not to look too hard at them. He opened the door. Like usual, it was unlocked. He stepped inside, expecting to find Pete sitting there in the corner, smoking a cigarette and reading the paper like always. But Pete wasn't there. Warren heard muffled voices coming from the back office. He was about to call out to Pete to let him know he was there, but that feeling, the same one he'd had the night out in the woods, gripped him, the one that told him to hold his tongue and stay quiet. Warren took a few slow and quiet steps toward the office. The door was closed, but the walls were thin. He could make out that there were two voices. "This wasn't what I signed up for. You didn't do the job, and now..." "Now what? You're going to leave? Pretend that you're not one half of this?" "I'm not saying that, but you were supposed to take care of it, and you've only made it worse. What if he remembers something from that day? What if..." "No, there's no way. And anyway, it's not over yet, babe. We'll get another chance. It'll be easier this time, too." "No, it'll look even more suspicious." Warren froze with fear. "Come on now. Don't tell me you've lost faith in me." "I haven't, honey, but we've spent so long planning this, making sure we wouldn't get caught, framing Leroy, making it so he would have a good motive. And what was it all for? I'm going to be spending the rest of my days taking care of an invalid husband." Warren had to clamp a hand over his mouth to keep from gasping loudly. No, he couldn't believe it. Clyde's new wife, Ada, and Pete had... Warren had heard it with his own two ears, but he still couldn't believe it. "That's not going to happen. Like I just told you, I'm going to take care of him, and then the store will be ours. We'll sell it, and we'll bust out of this town just like we always planned. I promise you, baby, I'll make it happen." Warren suddenly had a sinking feeling in his gut. He shouldn't be hearing these things. He shouldn't have been there. He needed to get out. He started quickly retracing his steps, being as quiet as he could. He almost made it too, but then the second to last floorboard let out a low creak. Warren cursed silently. It seemed that some people just weren't meant for sneaking around. Realizing the game was up, he bolted for the door. Running down the steps of the general store, running for his car, he was in the middle of the dirt road when he heard Pete's voice behind him. "I thought that might be you, kid." Warren's blood ran cold, and he stopped in his tracks at the unmistakable sound of the rifle cocking. Warren's heart hammered hard in his chest. He turned around slowly. He knew what kind of man Pete Driggs was now, the kind that not only could shoot a man in the back, but who could shoot his own brother in the back as well. "I don't want any trouble, Pete," Warren said, trying not to sound as scared as he felt. "Neither did I, but that's the hand we got dealt, kid." Warren gulped hard. The rifle barrel glistened in the dying sun. Why'd you do it?" he stammered, realizing that it was no use playing dumb now. Over Pete's shoulder, Warren could see Ada standing in the general store, lighting a cigarette. She was watching them through the window, seemingly enthralled by the spectacle taking place. She might not have pulled the trigger, but she was just as bad as Pete. "Simple, kid," Pete said. "I wanted Ada and I wanted the general store. and I wasn't going to wait around for either one. Warren hadn't expected Pete to be so blunt. Pete laughed at Warren's expression. Didn't see it coming, huh? Don't feel bad. Nobody else did either. So you framed Leroy, Warren said, realizing that the only thing now between him and that rifle was small talk. He never really stole anything, did he? We needed a fall guy, and Leroy Reed was born to be a fall guy. Pete started stepping down the steps of the store, making his way to Warren. This isn't personal, kid, so don't think too badly of me. Just a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Warren's insides trembled like cold green bean casserole, but he kept his head up and wouldn't break Pete's stare. If Pete was going to shoot him, he'd have to do it while looking him in the eyes. Coward, Warren said with all the venom he could muster. No good coward. Pete smiled, nearly letting out a laugh. Warren saw Pete's right index finger grip the trigger of the rifle. It was only a matter of time now. Warren thought of his mom and dad, of May, of empty seats in English class, and a pair of pretty brown eyes that would never be his. He held his breath, closed his eyes, and braced for the worst, waiting to hear the sound of the gun explode. But after a long moment of waiting, he heard something else instead. He flipped his eyes open and gazed at Pete. The smile had faded. The sirens grew louder and louder, and it seemed to Warren that the whole Poley County Sheriff's Office must be bumbling down the dirt road leading up to the lakes. The two of them just stood looking at each other. Then, suddenly, Pete dropped the rifle and took off running into the woods. So that was an action-packed one there at the end. So thank you so much for being here with me today for part 3 of Warren and the Sparks Lake Mystery. Next week we will wrap it up with the 4th part, and can't wait to share that last part with you. And yeah, I hope all of you are had a good weekend, and I'll see you next Friday for another segment of Meg's Cozy Happy Hour. So thanks so much. Bye, guys.